Hello, everyone. I'm Bobby Robbins, President of the University of Arizona. Thank you for joining us for our second webinar in the Wonder at Home series. The effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are broad-reaching, touching every facet of our lives. Today, we will hear from an interdisciplinary team of faculty working on a research study about the human-animal bond. We will hear about how that bond is affected by changes in social connections, consumer behavior, and feelings of loneliness induced by COVID-19. Now, I'd like to welcome Julie Funke, Dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine, who will introduce our panel. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, President Robbins. It's a great privilege for us to be able to share some updates about the College of Veterinary Medicine, including our keystone research focus to further our understanding and how to strengthen the human-animal bond to the benefit of the wellness of all animals, including human animals. First, a few updates about the college. Our inaugural class is full with 115 exceptional people. We're really looking forward to welcoming them here at our main campus location in Oro Valley starting this fall. We are a student-focused program, and what that means to us and that in all of our decisions, we think about how does this decision benefit the student. So in ways that we're doing this are using research-based, evidence-based teaching methods that we know are beneficial to students' retention and long-term learning, and help them build skill sets so they can be lifelong learners to the benefit of the health of animals. We also focus on building a culture that supports wellness in all its forms. And the way that we're doing that is both curricular, with a professional skills course that focuses on those things that are critical to professional success beyond medicine and surgery, such as communication skills, business acumen, the ability to work in teams, and quite frankly, really important for veterinary medicine as we are suffering a real wellness crisis in our profession, the ability for self-care and to have competency in taking care of the wellness of yourself and the people around you. We're doing that as a direct part of the curriculum, where students have to demonstrate that they're building wellness competencies as part of our expectations for their performance, in addition to co-curricular activities such as our wellness center that will be located here on the Oro Valley campus. Our focus on the human-animal bond also returns to our students. It is critical that veterinarians have understanding of the human-animal bond and in their practice help strengthen it. We can't do our work unless we fully understand how our clients are bonded to our animals. This is really so important for us to be able to help serve the health of the animals that we care so much for. The University of Arizona is uniquely positioned to be a first and only radically interdisciplinary place for the research into the human-animal bond. I'm really excited to introduce you to this group of researchers that are starting off on one of our initial studies to explore the human-animal bond, particularly in this time of stress secondary to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll let our researchers introduce themselves. I'll start with Dr. Reimann. Dr. Reimann, please.
Good morning, Julie. Thank you very much. My name is Martin Reimann. I'm an associate professor of marketing at the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona, and also an associate professor of cognitive science by courtesy in the cognitive science program that we have. My interest is broadly in psychology. I'm a psychologist by training and also a marketer. My research deals a lot with relationships. I'm very interested in the emotional, motivational underpinnings of human relationships, both between humans, but also between humans and brands, for example, in my consumption domain, objects, and most recently I have the opportunity to expand this research in the domain of human-animal bonds to see what are similarities and differences between human-to-human relationships, between human-object relationships, and why do we develop these relationships? Why do we maintain them? And what are some reasons sometimes why we dissolve relationships? Thank you very much for having me here today.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Evan MacLean, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona with appointments in the School of Anthropology, College of Veterinary Medicine, Psychology, and Cognitive Science. And broadly, my research aims to investigate questions about the nature of animal minds. So we are fundamentally interested in trying to get inside the minds of animals besides humans to learn about the ways that they think, how they represent and reason about the world, and how that's similar and different to the way that we think about the world as humans. So really trying to understand what it's like to be an animal, which has a lot of practical relevance to questions about thinking of our relationships with animals and really trying to understand how they perceive their end of our partnerships. I'm the director of the Arizona Canine Cognition Center, which is a research center on campus that is devoted to thinking specifically about dog behavior and cognition. So we do a lot of research with dogs in many different contexts, ranging from studying people's pet dogs to doing work with dogs that are placed in jobs where their roles are to help people in different capacities, for example, assistance dogs or therapy dogs. One other piece of our research program is specifically interested in the nature of the human-animal bond and trying to understand similarities and differences between our relationships with other people and our relationships with non-human animals, and how those relationships affect health and well-being, both in humans and in the non-human animals with whom we share those relationships.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. It's very exciting opportunity for us as a brand new College of Veterinary Medicine. I am Jamie Boehmer. I am the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies here at the University of Arizona College of Veterinary Medicine. My research area has focused more on areas related to One Health, specifically infectious disease in food animals in cattle, sheep, and goats. But I've also been engaged in research around human-animal bond, human-animal communication, probably before we even used that phrase or thought of it that way. Currently, in my role as Associate Dean, in addition to participating in the research collaboration with Martin and Evan, I'm also endeavoring, as Dr. Funke mentioned, to establish this core CVM research program centered on the human-animal bond and the impacts and effects of human relationships with animals, both from a human and an animal health perspectives. So why we chose to focus on this, I think Dr. Funke has said it very nicely, and this is really an area of research that's emerging to the forefront of veterinary research. And as well, a unique aspect of it is that it has to date involved researchers from a variety of different disciplines. So this really enables us in anchoring our program on this focus. It gives us an opportunity to really leverage some of the really deep and rich research expertise that we have amongst the University of Arizona research community, and to bring some diverse perspectives and varied expertise to answer some of these questions and to form an evidence base for some of the underlying aspects of the human-animal bond. It also, as Dr. Funke mentioned, is an amazing opportunity for us to enrich the training and preparation of our veterinary students and to equip them with a unique set of skills and perspectives that they will then take into their clinical years once they graduate and leave us and go into the clinics. And again, as Dr. Funke mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has really presented an opportunity for Evan and Martin and I to join our different perspectives and different expertise to kind of look at the human-animal bond and its impacts on the social isolation compared with social connectedness that we may have felt that's come about as a result of this pandemic and the shelter in place and the social distancing. And, at the same time, we're not the first to look at these types of relationships, but something that has brought us together, in addition to our different research areas, is the challenges that arise in examining human-animal bonds and kind of what has been done. So I think that's a good place for us to start our discussion of what we are proposing to do in our current study. And maybe, Evan, if you want to talk a little bit about some of these challenges, and then Martin, we can all just talk about some of the unique approaches that we're taking in our particular study and how we're kicking off this amazing program here at the College of Vet Med. So Evan, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about what's been done and some of those challenges too.
Sure. So as Jamie just mentioned, the questions about the potential role of pets on maybe protecting us from loneliness are longstanding questions that researchers have been investigating for decades at this point. But the challenge is that actually when you look at the sort of totality of research that has been done on this topic, you see all different kinds of conclusions emerging from that research. And so many times you have seemingly contradictory findings, and it's the kind of thing that if you sort of look at everything that's been done, you're left scratching your head at the end of the day, trying to figure out, well, what do pets really do for loneliness? And there are a number of things to point out here. And I think if you dig deeper into the literature on the relationship between pets and loneliness, there's a lot of sort of surprising things that jump out. One first thing is that if you just ask people, if you just ask pet owners, does your pet protect you from loneliness? You get an overwhelming response where almost everybody wants to say, yes, my connection to my pet is so important and it keeps me from being lonely. It provides me with social support. But just directly asking people that question can be problematic, in part because there's a widespread societal belief that pets are good for our health in some way. So people feel like that's the answer they should give. And also in part because when you do large systematic studies of people who are pet owners compared to people who are not pet owners, you can find very different things. So in some studies, as a matter of fact, researchers have found that in some cases, pet owners appear to be more lonely than not pet owners, which is exactly, the opposite of what we would predict if pets protected us from loneliness. So why would that be? Do pets actually make us lonely in some way? Well, you could make an argument for that. There are times when my friends have said, let's go out for happy hour. And I say, well, I can't come socialize with you because I have to go home and walk my dog. But I think maybe a better explanation is that because people feel that our connections with pets can protect us from loneliness, people who are suffering from loneliness may be more likely to get pets in the first place. So then if you compare pet owners to non-pet owners, you may be comparing a group of people who was initially a little bit more lonely and who got a pet basically as a form of self-medication in that context. On the other side of the coin, if you look at studies where pet owners have been found to be less lonely than non-pet owners, there are also a lot of sort of complications that creep in here because at the population level, pet owners tend to be different on many different demographic factors than non-pet owners. So, for example, pet owners are more likely to be married, they're more likely to be female, more likely to own a home, to be wealthy, and to have children. And all of these are things that may relate to loneliness in ways unrelated to pets. So there's a lot of confounds in simply sort of comparing pet owners to non-pet owners. And I think that those are a lot of the challenges that this literature has faced in the past, but they are things that hopefully we can overcome in some of the current research. So maybe it would be good if I handed it over to Martin for a second, just to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we are thinking about probing questions about the role of pets in protection from loneliness during these times.
Absolutely. So where I'm coming from is the consumer psychology and marketing domain. In my area, we're very interested, of course, how do consumers form relationships with brands. And what we found in some of the research that colleagues have done and that I have done is that the relationships we form with beloved products, beloved experiences, beloved brands are surprisingly similar to human and human relationships. So now what is very interesting in our current situation with the pandemic going on is, of course, that a lot of consumption experiences that we typically engage in, travel, for example, going to the mall, going shopping and things like that, entertainment, are not available. So we don't have that refuge, some people call it retail therapy, that we often use to improve our well-being, our psychological well-being. So as we all know, of course, today we have more of an inward focus, staying at home. So it's very interesting to see how do the humans that we live with, the animals, of course, that we live with, help us to manage the loneliness, cope with the stress that we get from social distancing and social isolation. So the way we're thinking about addressing this is experimentally. So as Evan pointed out, a lot of the existing evidence is correlational, which is still, of course, extremely interesting. What we were thinking about is, can we establish a bit of causality between the role of the animal and potentially mitigations of loneliness, coping with stress, and so on. And we'd like to compare that to other relationships, human to human relationships, of course, but also relationships that we have with objects, with brands, for example. There's a lot of research going on in the area where people actually, during the lack of a human relationship, form object relationships. People have been observed forming relationships with their chatbot, for example. People are observed, for example, in mother-child bonds, that children form deep relationships with their stuffed animals and their blankets and things like that. Now, one of the hypotheses we have that, of course, the pet, the animal, plays a special role and has particular emotional, motivational impact at mitigating some of the emotional distress that we may be experiencing. So that's what we're trying to study together.
I think it's really important too to point out that although a lot of the studies have been very interesting, really getting at what are those underlying motivations and what are the differences, why even within a family, why a pet may be beloved to one person and may not be to another. And that's unique perspective that you both bring in really being able to kind of get at that underlying reasons why, even in the realm outside of this particular study, but even in the realm of decision making, sort of the science of decision making around why is the classic example, why someone may spend $10,000 on their animals' cancer treatments, but their child takes out loans to go to college. So that's where it's really interesting, Martin, your perspective from the consumer standpoint, and where, Evan, you're really looking at those bonds and sort of the canine cognition piece and sort of what that looks like. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit too about dogs in particular and our relationships with dogs and some of the things that you think about in your studies, and then kind of getting at sort of some of that decision making, because I think those are some of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, those are great questions. I think you bring up an important point in that sort of when you frame the question as a very broad one, what impact do pets have, say, on loneliness or on health? We gloss over the fact that there is a tremendous amount of variation in the nature of relationships we have with animals. So if we were studying, for example, the value of human social relationships, we would never ask a question as broad as, what is the impact of a human relationship on your health, right? That would become a very nuanced question. And what is the effect of different kinds of relationships, right? What is the effect of a relationship where you have a great deal of social support compared to a relationship where you don't have that kind of support? So this is really one of the new frontiers in thinking about human-animal interactions, moving away from these sort of broad group-based comparisons where you think about things like people who have pets, people who don't have pets, to really trying to characterize the nature of those individual relationships and how the quality of particular relationships impacts health and well-being on both ends of the equation. In terms of thinking about dogs a little bit specifically and the nature of their relationships with people, there's a lot of evidence at this point that one of the ways that dogs sort of fit into human families is very much in a childlike kind of role. So there's a lot of human psychology work that looks at the way that people think about pets and dogs in particular. And pretty much, the majority of people say that they think about their dog basically as a child in the family. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence of that, researchers have used a variety of techniques that are often used in developmental psychology to, for example, look at the attachment and the bond formed between a parent and a child. And we've translated some of these paradigms to work with dogs. So there's a test, for example, called the Ainsworth Strange Situation Test that is typically done with young babies. And it's a test where they're sort of initially together with their mother, and then their mother leaves, and they can sort of explore an environment without this attachment figure, and someone else will come in the room. It's potentially a distressing thing, and then their attachment figure comes back in. And in human children, you see very different sort of attachment styles there. And one thing that we have learned looking at social relationships between dogs and people is that those relationships seem to have many of the same properties as the relationships we see between parents and their human children. So there's a lot to be learned here if we can begin to sort of characterize the nature of the human bond at deeper levels, much in the same way that it's been done in developmental psychology, that I think will help us moving forward in these topics.
I want to thank Martin too with the science of decision making. If we could talk a little bit about that, because I think that's one of our a big interest of ours too, is really understanding that motivation system and what your perspectives, Martin, are from looking at things more from a consumer standpoint and a marketing standpoint. So I'm interested in just kind of sharing with everyone sort of that whole decision making process too, and where that plays in.
Absolutely. So I think there is a lot of new insights to be gained from the study of the human-animal bond. Like Dr. Funke pointed out at the beginning, we need to understand how the client, so that's the veterinary professional's client, is bonded to the animal. And I think the decision-making science and practice can provide important input here. So for example, it'd be very interesting to see what is the level of involvement that we have, that the client has, the pet or animal owner with the animal. Is that a high involvement relationship that requires a lot of care? So I'm thinking, for example, of horse owners. Or is that a rather low involvement or medium involvement relationship with smaller animals, for example? There's a lot to be said here about the level of involvement, how that impacts the pet owner, how it impacts their decision-making, of course. And that's something veterinary professionals, should not only know, but can actively use to improve the client relationship, and then also get to the animal. And so that's one way. Then the length of the relationship is very important. Is the human-animal relationship, is that recently formed, or is that a long-term relationship? Dr. Boehmer mentioned, the paradox that some people are spending thousands and thousands of dollars of medical treatment on their animals, but maybe not on human relationships. So why is that? So that's, I think, is very important. Is it a long-term relationship? Is it a recently formed relationship? And that determines a lot of things. Then I'm also very curious about what's the intensity and the involvement and the number of human relationships that animal owner has. Are they living alone at home? Is the animal the only other, I don't want to say person, but relationship partner in a sense, right? Often we use personality traits, of course, to describe all kinds of things, including animals. So I think those are some of the decision-making concepts that we have thought about in the business and marketing domain often, and that could be applied to to shed light on how the client is bonded to the animal, and I think that can, inform the way veterinary professionals interact and relate to their clients and the animal.
That's a really good point. And then Dr. Funke and I both mentioned, we really see this research area as being something to enrich veterinary student training, especially in really being able to understand a client's bond with their animals and to be able to improve communication skills around that. So that's one area that we see. At the College of Veterinary Medicine, we get a lot of questions, to bring it back to the pandemic and kind of the things that we're looking at in our collaboration. Aside from that, though, a lot of questions come up about, well, what's going to happen when the pandemic is over, right? And what are some of those challenges, both from the animal side and the human side, that we're going to have to be mitigating? And again, I see this as being something that's very important to veterinary student training, because the veterinarians are going to probably be the first line of defense in mitigating some of these issues that I could anticipate would be separation anxiety on the part of the pet, and causing some stress too on the human side, just knowing that your pet is stressed and induces stress in humans. So I don't know, Evan, if there's some other things that you might want to add to that about your perspectives as to some of the challenges, or Martin, if there's other things, because I know we're all getting these questions all the time, about what happens when COVID is over.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenging time, as you say, both for people and their pets. And, thinking about dogs specifically, at least, dogs are animals that seem to thrive on routines, right? So once you have a routine set up and they know what they're expecting, things tend to go well. And to a certain extent, humans are that way as well. If you look at the things that cause us distress, their unpredictability and change. So at the beginning of this pandemic, there were a lot of changes in that, normally the people who got in the car and drove to work so that, Fluffy could hop on the sofa and sleep all day. Now those people are home all the time. And that could come with, good and bad things. If you live in a house that is, full of children who have an interest in the animal and are, trying to touch and chase this animal all around the house, this could actually have become, a slightly more stressful time for some of those animals. On the other hand, I think many pets are thrilled to have a lot more human company during this time, and weaning them off that is going to be a big challenge. So, separation anxiety is one of the biggest behavioral problems that we face with companion animals, particularly dogs. And, that's a problem outside of just sort of in everyday life outside of the pandemic. But now coming from this period where people have been home 24 hours a day with all this contact, and if they're going to start going back, to offices and things like that, there's certainly going to be an uptick in separation anxiety, and that's going to be hard. I think one thing people can do in that situation is to try not to make black and white transitions. So don't go from being home 24 hours a day for weeks on end to, working 10-hour days in an office and not seeing your animals. So I think if you can, begin by working half days or going in every other day, these are things that can help the animals to adapt in those circumstances. On the human side, one other thing is that, quite frankly, we get out of relationships what we put into them, right? And I think a lot of people have had, in many ways, an amazing opportunity. It's sort of a silver lining to what has happened during COVID-19, in that people have had more time with their animals. Dogs are getting, walks in the middle of the day that they didn't used to get. And so people have been able to sort of invest more in these relationships. And one of the challenges that we're going to face as humans is, as we get drawn back into the regular working world, going to the office and such, how do we maintain that sort of investment that we built up? Because I think it comes with a lot of good things, and many people have forged closer relationships with animals during this time. The challenge for us is going to be, how do we hang on to those things, and how do we make sure that the good practices we've developed during all this time with animals don't just go away the second we go back to our normal lives.
Yeah. I think it's a strong point about easing things in. even when you're at home, if your dogs have a particular place or your cats have a particular place where they are. I know for me, my dogs being in the kennel, I've got some young dogs. We're trying to ease them back into that environment because they haven't had to be there. So reestablishing routines for sure, I think is going to be a key point there for sure. Julie, I don't know if we want to start taking some questions from our registrants.
Yeah, we do have some questions that we've collected, and so I'll start with those, and then I'll maybe either direct it or you could decide who's the best one to maybe address it. So I know that we've started out this conversation by saying that there's some challenges with the existing research regarding perhaps some bias in the populations looked at or confounding associated with comparing pet owners to non-pet owners. But I'm wondering whether there is any evidence that you feel that seems to be pretty consistent in the literature about what impact animals do have on emotional well-being, or things that you would feel comfortable sharing that would be despite what you see as some challenges in the current research.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to this question. So yeah, with the caveat that these effects vary between people and depend on the nature of your relationship with animals. There's a long history of studies showing that the right kinds of interactions with pets can have very beneficial effects on things ranging from our mood to our physical health. So there have been a lot of studies that have intentionally placed people into relatively stressful situations and then given them an opportunity to have an animal companion during that time or not. And some of the main findings that have emerged from that type of research is that in general, pets seem to have a relatively protective effect on our mood. And they really blunt our stress response in a number of situations. So if you look at the physiology of people facing stressors, either with or without a companion animal, often when we have a companion animal with us, you see that people will have a decreased heart rate, they have decreased blood pressure, and they have reduced cortisol production. And cortisol is a hormone that's involved in the stress response. There are also some studies that show that when we interact with pets in loving and friendly kinds of ways, this can lead to an increase in oxytocin release. And oxytocin is a hormone that is very involved in different kinds of emotional states, but particularly in social bonds. It plays a critical role in the initial bond between a mother and her infant. It plays roles in romantic bonds. And we see that interacting with dogs in certain kinds of situations can increase oxytocin levels, which is thought to have relatively wide-ranging health benefits. So those are just a few examples of how dogs and other companion animals can impact our biology.
Thank you. I have a second question, which is kind of the opposite side, is because it's almost asking a little bit about what do we know about people who choose to have animals and those that don't. So the question is really, why are some people drawn to having animals or being around them more than other people? From that standpoint, are there things that we know about those different demographies and generally who decides to have a pet and who doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in again, but I don't want to take this from anybody else. One thing we're actually learning about recently is that there seem to be some genetic factors that determine whether people are attracted to having pets. And this is work that has come from studies of monozygotic and dizygotic twins, so fraternal and identical twins. And identical twins are much more likely to be matched in terms of whether they get a pet later in life than are fraternal twins, despite having been raised in similar kinds of environments. And it's estimated that up to about 50% of the variation in whether people get pets may be attributable to some genetic factors. Another thing that seems to be important, though, is the environment that you grow up in. So there are a lot of studies showing that people who grew up around animals, if they had pets, as a child, they grow up to be people that are more likely to seek those kinds of relationships with animals. The challenge there is we don't know to what extent those effects are driven by the environmental exposure to having pets growing up versus the fact that most people are growing up with their parents and inheriting their parents' genes, which may have shaped the parents' decision to get a pet in the first place, and then those genetic effects may, reproduce themselves in the children. And in some ways, that's not surprising. We would, just to be clear, we don't think that there are, genes for wanting a pet or something like that. But many aspects of our personality are highly heritable. Genetic factors explain a lot of personality differences between people. And, certainly personality characteristics play into decisions about whether or not we want to bring animals into our lives.
And I would add to that too, that it's a very interesting question, and it points to one of the reasons why we are anchoring our program around this to really get at some of these questions. And again, some of the evidence-based for it, that aside from the genetics, really kind of teasing out some of those things about the environment. So it's a very interesting question, and one that I hope that through our efforts and bringing in other expertise as well, that we'll be able to actually get some data to support some of the hypotheses that are out there.
And just as a testament to those environmental effects, one of the things we've seen during COVID-19 is that as soon as people were sequestered at home, there was a huge uptick in adoptions of animals from shelters. And so, that's not a genetic effect. That's possibly an effect of people, suddenly feeling a little bit alone and disconnected in the world, and maybe seeking these kinds of relationships with pets, potentially as a way to fulfill our very basic needs to be socially connected to others.
Mm-hmm. And we've also the three of us have talked about that from a consumer standpoint. Martin, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about the heritability and genetic research there in the animal domain, and there's a lot of overlap also to human relationships. We have done some work with fraternal twins and seen that trust in human relationships actually has a heritable component, has a genetic component, versus distrust is more something that is socialized. So I think here it's very interesting to explore what are the links between what animal researchers have found and what human relationship researchers have found. Is there a trusting personality that is more likely to engage in a human-animal relationship? Would be something I think worthwhile of study. So to describe, and then more generally to describe, the personality that is more likely to engage in a human-animal relationship, because obviously it is a relationship that requires a lot of involvement, time investment, monetary investment. There's a lot of benefits to be gained from it also. So I think there is evidence that sheds light on the demographics, and a couple examples were mentioned here.
Yeah, I'd just say quickly that it's another place where trying to point the causal arrow in the right direction can be tricky. So when you talk about personality characteristics, for example, there have been a number of studies that show that people that grow up with pets tend to be more empathic than people who don't. But what we don't know is, does having a pet make you empathic? And it's very possible. People talk about this as a real benefit for children growing up with pets because, unlike other people, pets can't use language and tell you, I want this, or, don't do that. So it's a real practice for kids to think about, well, what is this animal telling me? What do they want right now? And so that could promote the development of empathy, in which case pets sort of could cause empathy. But the flip side of that is that people who are more empathic to begin with may be more likely to relate to animals and want to, nurture them and care for them. So there are associations, and figuring out what causes what is really where the challenging work is.
I think it's also important to study what is the personality that we see in the animal. So oftentimes animal owners describe their pet in terms of personality traits. This is a calm animal, or exciting, and things like that, active. And this is of course descriptions that we use to describe other humans. Also how to describe the relationship that we have with other humans. So I wondered what are the best matches between one's own personality and the personality of the animal, the perceived personality from the animal owner standpoint, of course, and then also the actual behavior of the animal. And to what degree does there need to be a match between one's personality and the perceived personality of the animal? And how does that develop over time, I think, is a very interesting question. So I think those are some additional follow-up questions in that domain.
I just want to add one very last quick thing to that, to go back to Evan's point about empathy and the communication piece, that, animals communicate non-verbally, and that could tend to lead to this feeling of unconditional love, which could most certainly inspire deeper empathy. So I could certainly see that being an interesting area as well to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Great, and we have a question from our attendees that I think follows into this quite well, which is thinking about these bonds and the way that people think about those bonds and those benefits. Are there any implications or applications of this work for rescue agencies who are working hard to try to improve adoption relationships, basically to strengthen that bond so that there's retention of animals in homes? Do you see any application of the research to that question?
I'd like to take a stab at this one first, because I want to go back to the emphasis on how this improves our veterinary student training, and to reemphasize that any way that we can better understand the relationships and the underlying motivations in those relationships between an animal and its pet would certainly help us perhaps mitigate people giving up their animals. It may lead to us being able to better understand what are some of the motivations, the common motivations for people to relinquish their pets to shelters. And the flip side of that, for sure, understanding better how to pair people to certain animals, as we were talking about with different personality traits, and to improve adoption rate successes.
I think that's an incredible point. And it, I think it sort of speaks to the fact that often when people think about animals, you think about, if you look at reasons that animals are relinquished to a shelter, right? You might see a particular behavior problem that was listed or something like that. And often in those situations, we sort of treat the animal as the unit of analysis, right? This is a dog who has, an attachment problem or an anxiety problem or something like that. But really for veterinarians, I think an important thing to look at is that those are not features of the animal in isolation. Those are features of a relationship, and the animal is part of the family system. And so, not just talking about, this dog is this and this dog is that, something like that, but really understanding the dynamics of, this dog may be this way in a relationship with somebody who is that way, but very different in another kind of relationship. So taking sort of a systems level approach where you really look at animals inside the sort of family and social environments that they're a part of is a really critical thing to do.
I'm sorry, just the saying, a quantitative approach might be worthwhile to assess and ask simple questions at the beginning. Have you had an animal in the past? How long was that relationship? How would you describe yourself? What are you looking for in an animal? So I think there could be a systematic way, and some of this is done, but a systematic way to establish a better match between the human and the animal when it comes to rescue shelters, for example.
And we have another question that I think kind of piggybacks on that really well, which is the question around the nature of the bond, or understanding people's decision making around different types of pets, whether it be a horse or a goat or a dog or a gerbil, and or even breeds, and often different breeds become popular and then are not popular, which is almost like a branding phenomenon, right? So I think there's some questions around that, which is on the flip side, why do people, do we know anything that is different about the relationship between different types of pets and different breeds within, like different breeds of dogs? And on the flip side, does that help us understand, or do we understand about why people choose certain pets or different breeds?
I think so. From a branding perspective and a marketing perspective, consumers form relationships with brands that oftentimes fit their own personality, and brands are markers for products that have been advertised over time, and to which characteristics have been assigned to personality characteristics. Brand X may be a very excited brand, Y may be a rugged brand, and things like that, and has to do with advertising. So I think we can definitely, I definitely see a link here to brands or breeds of different dogs that in their behavior and then the way we see them, and they have been bred over time, have certain personality characteristics. And I think here the decision making on what type of animal you want to engage with definitely is based on that personality match. So I think there's a lot of linkage here between how we form relationships with objects, with brands, and then how we form relationships with animals.
Yeah, and if you look at the history of the popularity of different breeds in this country, you see something that is exactly what Martin is describing. And obviously, we don't intentionally advertise dogs. There's no, Irish Setter lobbying group that goes to Congress and tries to make Irish Setters popular. But there are periods in history where, for whatever reason, particular breeds become incredibly common, and they have a sort of fad-like thing where there becomes a widespread awareness or belief something about these dogs, and then it goes away and another breed becomes popular in its place. And sometimes these things can be linked to things, for example, like Disney movies and sort of public exposure to certain ideas. But there is a real sort of consumer mentality here where people are responding to the information generally available to them and using that to make decisions. And that may not always be the best practice, because those are, decisions that are based on sort of, what's in vogue now in terms of getting a dog, rather than what is the right dog that would actually work well in my family. So that's something to be aware of.
I think the other piece to that too, as Julie mentioned, horses, goats, other types of animals. We focused a lot on dogs, naturally, in this conversation, but there's also other animals. And I think it's very interesting that what may draw someone to form the same type of bond that you think about with the dog that lives in your house, with your horse or with a goat, and what draws people to certain types of different animals. And there's certainly a fair amount of evidence to show that horses, the human animal connection to horses, to cats, is just as strong as that to dogs. But again, getting at what draws someone to a horse versus a dog, and is it some sort of branding, for lack of a better word, or some sort of personality trait or some sort of underlying need that draws someone to one species versus another. So I think that's a very interesting angle as well.
So we've run to the end of our time. But first of all, I really want to thank our panelists. I think it's so exciting to hear all good research, it begets more questions, right? And so there are just a tremendous amount of really interesting questions to really help us understand the human-animal bond in a really novel and truly interdisciplinary way. And one of the things I hope this conversation was able to highlight is just how strong it is and what a great opportunity there is at the University of Arizona for a real interdisciplinary approach, and to try to look at this bond from many different perspectives, which I think is going to just help us explode our knowledge base and understanding of the human-animal bond. And that's really one of the great things about a place like the University of Arizona, and why we really have just an incredible opportunity here to just lead nationally and internationally around research that will explore and help strengthen the human-animal bond. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I apologize for not being able to get to all of our questions, but I hope we were able to at least address enough of them, and hope help you be excited about the kind of work we're able to do here at the University of Arizona. Thank you, everyone. Bear down. Go Cats.